now in order to consider amendment number 4 printed in the House Report 118-4. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in House Report number 118-4, offered by Mr. Cloud of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 166, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cloud, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The intent of the REIN In Act is to ensure that the executive branch is taking into account inflation in our country before they issue new regulations. Our country has seen the rising inflation over the last 2 years, and inflation is affecting all of us. It's affecting our families, especially those with lower incomes who don't have as much of a cushion to deal with what we're seeing as they face increasing costs, especially in gas and in groceries. But as we consider the cost of inflation, we should also consider the cost of debt servicing in what we're doing, because too often we as a government don't do the same thing that we expect our families to do, and that when someone goes to purchase a car, for example, or a house, they have to include the cost of interest that they're going to pay on those kind of things. We regularly ignore that as if it wasn't an important part of what we spend on, when in fact it's about $600 billion of spending annually. This is why I offered my amendment to the REIN In Act. My amendment would amend the bill to direct the Office of Management and Budget and the Council of Economic Advisors to incorporate inflationary impact of debt servicing costs into the reports that they create. Rising interest rates have the same effect on costs of spending on the national result as well. We see rising interest rates have the same meaning for our countries as the families that we encounter. But in order to accurately account for what we're spending, we cannot ignore the cost of debt servicing or the real cost that will be accrued with new spending. The Committee for Responsible Federal Budget released a report today that estimated net interest will total $10.5 trillion over the next decade. As lawmakers, we have a duty to be honest about the effects of our actions, and this amendment will keep us honest about the true effects of our spending. I encourage support of my amendment and the underlying legislation as well, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland
Madam Chair, I rise to claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you so much. And ask if the gentleman would be willing to yield for a couple of questions, because again, there was no hearing in committee, so I'm not sure I understand this. This might be a great idea, but I want to try to figure it out. It requires that any inflationary estimates prepared incorporate the inflationary impact of debt servicing costs, which seems perfectly logical to me. But is there a reason to think that the current inflation rate, as defined by the U.S. government, does not incorporate the inflationary impact of debt servicing costs?
Yes, it's been regular practice with CBO. I've been working to get this done for the CBO as well since I've got here in Congress. It's the common practice among all the entities that we look for wisdom and advice and guidance on budgeting and spending, that the cost of debt servicing is not counted into their projections. And
and that's true across the board in terms of all of the economic indicators that we read about, whether it's the
information that we get to take into account, like when we're evaluating a bill and what we think the 10-year projected cost is. Yes, typically it does not include the debt servicing cost.
Okay, to reclaim my time, and thank you for your kind answers, sir. You know, this really is why we have hearings in Congress, because it feels like we're just posting a lot of graffiti on a wall here. I don't know how the inflation rate is calculated. I don't know whether the import of this amendment would be to double count debt servicing costs, because I don't know which government agencies actually incorporate debt servicing costs and which don't. One thing I do know is that if the gentleman has the greatest amendment of the year, it's still basically irrelevant because it does nothing. In other words, it's not going to do anything to bring down anybody's debt servicing costs, which I agree are huge. Unlike, for example, what the Biden administration has done in terms of student debt by acting dramatically to bring it down, even though there are people from across the aisle who are in court today, I believe, trying to get that thrown out. and trying to bring everybody's student loan debt back up. That's real economic action. In any event, what this is about is pure symbolism. In other words, they're asking for a reporting bill that will only apply if there's $1 billion plus impact. And the good gentleman comes forward to say, well, make sure, Mr. President, when you're doing your calculations, you include debt servicing costs. Well, I don't know. You could take it or leave it. It doesn't do anything for people who are staggering under debt the way that the Biden administration is trying to act, for example, to deal with the problem of student debt, or the way that we've acted to try to help people who are suffering under mortgage debt. That's real economic action. So with that, I'm just going to have to consider it carefully given the information we have. But I will end with a plea for the good chairman of the Oversight Committee, the distinguished gentleman from Kentucky. We have to have hearings on these bills so we know what we're talking about, because I feel like we're dancing in the dark here. I'll reserve the remainder of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, I would once again point out that we spend approximately $600 billion a year in interest payments. Yet we do not count the cost of what the debt servicing will cost in anything we do. Now, that's in short order expected to eclipse our military spending, which is our #1 constitutional priority for our federal spending. So whatever we want to do up here, if we do not begin to count the real cost of what we're doing, we will be off. And right now we are having to deal with a debt ceiling issue because the previous Congress decided to spend without considering the cost of what it was going to take and to push us toward the limit. And so we are cognizant of the fact that we are spending. We're going to monitor our spending in a way that we leave a better country for our kids and for our grandkids, and this is part of making sure that we are actually counting the real cost of what we're doing as we take each step. And I would like to yield a minute to the distinguished chair of the Oversight Committee, my good friend Comer from Kentucky.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in support of the amendment. Often when inflation is considered, people fail to consider one of its important effects. That effect is on how much more it costs taxpayers to pay interest on our federal debt. Those interest payments are high, and they spike higher when interest rates rise. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that the federal government would pay $400 billion in interest on the federal debt during fiscal year 2022. And the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget projected at the time that for every 1% increase in interest rates, those annual payments would rise by $38 billion. Remember, that's for fiscal year 2022, when the federal debt and interest rates were lower than they are now. My colleague amendment makes sure the impact on the federal debt service costs will not be overlooked in the inflation impact assessments the bill requires. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I just repeat my puzzlement from before. Perhaps if Mr. Cloud would yield for another question, well, what is the inflationary impact of debt servicing costs? Have there been any economic studies on that?
What we're trying to do is to make sure that the debt servicing cost is included into these studies we're getting. You know, eventually I have a bill, for example, to do it with the Congressional Budget Office, so we'd like to see that as well. This would make sure that we're getting this done in the REIN Act with the OMB and the Council on Economic Advisors. And so it's common sense. To me, this should be bipartisan. We should really be counting the cost of what we're actually spending. This isn't really meant to be a controversial bill, except for those who don't want to really know what we're actually spending.
Reclaiming my time, I would just say, I think you raise a very interesting point. I would love to know the answer to whether or not it's actually incorporated today and what the inflationary or deflationary effects are of debt servicing costs. And obviously this bill and this amendment would not have any impact on what those debt servicing costs are, but I don't see much of a problem of adding this language to the hortatory nature of the legislation. Happy to reserve.
The gentleman reserves from Texas.
Yeah, and if I would just add, It may not change what we're doing, but it would change the knowledge of what we're doing here in Congress. And the fact that we continue to spend money without even knowing how much money we're spending, I think is a problem, and certainly not the due diligence that we should have as members of Congress, being diligent with the public trust that we've been given. And so us having the real cost estimates before us is going to be very valuable as we go forward to understand exactly what we're doing as we begin to evaluate legislation, and for the administration when they're dealing with regulations they're proposing.
Does the gentleman yield back?
Yes, I yield.
The gentleman from Maryland.
Madam Chair, I'll just close on this one with this thought. The majority comes forward with a plan to say we want to know an estimated inflationary impact of an executive order, and then we have a series of Christmas tree amendments saying, and make sure you include the cost to rural areas, make sure you include the cost of
Time
debt
has
servicing.
expired.
I would like the overall cost. Thank you. Yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Those who oppose say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. If the gentlewoman will the gentlewoman would suspend. The chair understands that amendment number 5 will not be offered. It is now in order to consider amendment number 6, printed in House Report 118-4. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 6, printed in House Report number 118-4, offered by Ms. Jackson